Hi, shalom friends. Let me take you back some 60, 70 years in the land of Israel. And we're talking about the products of the kibbutz. If you're not sure what a kibbutz is, Google it. But essentially it's a community organization. They work the land together. They shared upbringing of the children together. And by and large, the kibbutzim in those days was very, not only not religious, but to a certain extent anti-religious in terms of tradition. In fact, they used to look at the bearded Jews and the women who still wore shaitels, who wore wig coverings, as that's from Eastern Europe, and the Holocaust destroyed that life. And in Israel, it's a new everything, a new Israeli, a new Jew, a new land, modernity, Jewish traditions, yes, and holidays, yes, but not the rituals, Anyway, one of those products was a wonderful young lady. Her name was Ruti. The story is true, though the names, of course, are fictitious. And this Ruti grew, and she went into medicine, and she became a registered nurse. And in those days, it was quite common to have clinics in many of the different places, and she would be there, and she would, make sure that the clinic ran well. During this time, of course, she's maturing, and she sees many of the different patients. Now, you have to remember, before cell phones, people went in a waiting room were pretty anxious, and you're just waiting. So there's a couple of magazines. Usually they're outdated, nothing much to read. So there's a sort of a tension or an anxiety in a waiting room of a clinic. But Ruti was very impressed. There was one elderly lady, not terribly old, maybe 70, maybe 68. Her name was Mrs. Meiselish. She was always calm. And she would be a regular because she was on a certain type of medicine that had to be modulated. And she had to be supervised. So like once every 2 weeks or so, she would come. And just to get a very quick checkup. In the meantime, Ruti had a chance to observe her. So while many of the people were on pins and needles, this Mrs. Meiselish would come, and she always brought like a leather-bound siddur, which means a prayer book, and she would sit and read. And she was very impressed, Ruti, by this. Though Ruti herself was not religious or observant, she noticed that this Mrs. Meiselish is calm. And it obviously has something to do with that book called the prayer book. So one time she says to Mrs. Meiselish, Mrs. Meiselish, why are you always praying? And what do you pray for? She says, first of all, I'm not always praying, but you should know. I gave her she gave Ruti a very quick lesson that Jewish people pray formally 3 times a day. The longest prayer is in the morning because Mrs. Meiselish wakes up a little bit later. She doesn't usually have time to finish it. So when she's waiting in the waiting room, she finishes the prayer. And it calms her because she knows she's in the good hands of the Almighty. Ruti, in spite of her not being religious or observant, and sort of brought up with a disdain to rituals, was very impressed. And she was thinking to herself, she would like to be calm as well. So she says to Mrs. Meiselish, she says, so how many pages do you actually read? And Mrs. Meiselish, who was a very religious girl, said something to the effect like 28 pages in the morning and 12 pages at the night. And Ruti puts up her hand and she says, oh, forget it, this is not for me. And Mrs. Meiselish very, very kindly says, you know what, why don't you just start with 1 page? 1 page. So she says, Ruti says to Mrs. Meiselish, you have a particular prayer? She says, no, why don't you choose? So here's the book, Make Believe, and Ruti takes the book and randomly opens up to the first couple of pages. And Mrs. Meiselish says, fine. After my appointment, let's go into your room and we'll take a photostat. And that's the page that you'll say. And that's what they did. Let me fast forward. Years pass. Ruti's married. She has 3 children. And all girls. And raising children and raising teenagers is never easy. And in Israel, it's not any easier. And Ruti had her hands full. She loved her girls, the girls loved her, and there was the usual spats and stresses and arguments and acting out, and you don't know what you're talking about, and she weathered it as well as anyone else. And then, believe it or not, her second child, Shoshana, at the age of 17, found religion. Yeah, somehow she had a friend who was observant, and little by little, this Shoshana she started with modesty. She stopped wearing some of the attire which is less than traditional, and she progressed into changing her diet, not eating not kosher, and then progressing to Shabbos, which put quite a stress on the family. But Ruthie grudgingly gave her a lot of credit that the other girls are acting out in one way. At least her girl, the middle girl, is acting out in a completely different way. She's becoming more religious and traditional. Something that maybe her great-grandmother would have admired. And she noticed something which again had a great effect on her. Of the three girls, the one that seemed the most settled was the middle one. Though she was acting, contrary to the way she was brought up, she seemed to be the most calm and the most settled, most focused, and the easiest to actually deal with. And that had an effect on Ruthie herself. So over the years, Shoshana, of course, gets married to a religious guy and has religious grandchildren. Ruthie herself is becoming religious. When she came 60, it was only really another 2-3 years before she would take early retirement. The people that she was working with could hardly recognize the Ruthie who was there now to the Ruthie that started maybe some 20-odd years earlier. Because the Ruthie now was keeping the Sabbath and kosher and modestly dressed, and everything that she had made fun of or had misunderstood some 20-odd years ago somehow had changed. She became that person who she used to look down at. Finally, at the goodbye party, they asked her, what caused you to change your lifestyle from completely irreligious, just somewhat traditional, to a fully practicing, observant Jewess? So she said, my daughter, Shoshana. She became religious, and I saw the way she was living, and I saw who she married, and I see the way she's raising her children, and I want to be part of that. But then she said with a smile, I have to tell you though, when I started to become more observant, learning from Shoshana, I didn't see it as a change. I knew it was going to happen one day or other. So they asked her, how? She said it all started from one day, one page of prayer. And she told over the story of Mrs. Meislis, and she said, I want to let you know, for the last 20 years before I actually learned how to use the prayer book, I used to say only one page of the prayer book. And with a big smile, she says, you know which page I picked? It was random. It was the page that talks about, may Hashem create a Jewish family, and may my children and grandchildren grow up to be occupied in Torah. So I was saying it. I have no idea why I was saying it, because I didn't even believe in it. But I had promised Mrs. Meiselish. But now, in retrospect, I realized that by saying this prayer over and over, once a day, that's all I said, once a day, a page. But in that page, I asked that God give me good grandchildren who will walk in His ways. I saw it unfold. And that charming story is how I will close today, by letting you know you don't need a whole prayer book. All you need is one page of the prayer book. In fact, you don't even need a page of the prayer book. All you need is one sincere prayer, because that little encompasses a lot. And of course, as we're leaving the holy holiday of Hanukkah, right? One small little jug of oil lasted for 8 days. That's not correct. It lasted forever. Because today, 2,100 years after the miracle, we're still lighting an oil candle or a candle made out of wax. Why? Because of that little cruse of oil. So friends, big is not necessarily better. Small is not necessarily a detriment of anything. God desires the heart, and the Jewish heart, I believe, and you know, is always whole and sincere. Shalom.